there's so many challenges along the way. So you really have to feel compelled, I think, to bring something into being, because the sort of like inertia of the world is for this thing not to exist. I saw this phrase on a billboard here in Miami. I like to think this is representative of Miami culture, but it was a twist on an old phrase that said, "Give me the strength to change the things I cannot accept." The name Moderne itself is obviously a nod to modernization, as you referred to, but Art Moderne was actually a specific subset of the Art Deco movement as well. I remember our designer at the time saying, whatever we pick, it's not going to feel right for a while. And so I'm glad we did that very early and established that identity very soon. Netflix at that time was famous for its culture called freedom and responsibility. Luckily, this is a technology and a product that was, I would say, dragged out of me and us over time, as opposed to something that was inspired to develop. The software production has been largely industrialized and componentized. Tech debt is really, it almost has a negative connotation, I think, in the engineering industry. I think the problem is really well known by the economic buyer. And then the idea was really, if you're going to hire the sort of the best of the best, just get out of their way. As the Gen AI wave has kind of come around, I think we've recognized that I still don't really want an AI system mutating the code directly, because it would lead to, potential for hallucination. AI can help me write net new recipes, which are programs faster. We have a product that's very modular in nature that can continue to add value to shareholders, and not every product is that way.
This is the Business Philosopher Within You podcast. I'm your host, Bhavesh Naik. An important topic we like to explore on this podcast is the human factors that go into building a thriving business that can stand the test of time, even when that business is grounded in using artificial intelligence as its core premise. The guest I have for you today has built just such a business. Jonathan Schneider is the CEO and co-founder of Moderne, which is a developer platform for auto refactoring and analyzing code base across thousands of projects and millions of lines of code. The unique intellectual property enables you to accurately transform code in multiple repositories at once by safely leveraging AI. Jonathan is the visionary who founded Open Rewrite, an open source auto refactoring tool at Netflix, and went on to found the Micrometer project as a member of the Spring team. He is a Java champion as well as the author of SRE with Java Microservices and a co-author of Automated Code Remediation, How to Refactor and Secure the Modern Software Supply Chain, which were both published by O'Reilly. I'm pleased to have you on this podcast, Jonathan.
Thank you. I'm also pleased to be here.
If you can take us back a little bit, Jonathan, when you started Moderne, so what is the meaning of that name? That's a really nice name. I like it. And for branding reasons, it also kind of has a nice modern name to it. And I have a feeling that there is some story behind that. And with that, what was the inspiration that kind of made you think, hey, I want to start a company doing code refactoring?
Yeah, the name Moderne itself is obviously a nod to modernization, as you referred to, but Art Moderne was actually a specific subset of the Art Deco movement as well. And hometown, my hometown in sort of West St. Louis County had predominantly an Art Deco style. A lot of it was built in the 20s, so it was a bit of a reference to hometown as well as application modernization at the same time.
Awesome, right. And what was your inspiration for starting the company?
Luckily, this is a technology and a product that was, I would say, dragged out of me and us over time, as opposed to something that I feel like I was inspired to develop. So initially at Netflix, I had joined the engineering tools team almost 10 years ago now.
Yeah.
And Netflix at that time was famous for its microservices architecture, AWS usage, but also this culture called freedom and responsibility, which meant that central teams like us, engineering tools, couldn't impose constraints on what product engineers did. So we couldn't break their software build at a particular time because they weren't compliant with a certain measure. And so in one respect, as a central team, we were responsible for moving the organization forward onto the latest versions of Java, or to help with EC2 Classic to VPC migration, or whatever the case might be.
Sure.
But we couldn't impose a deadline or a hard requirement on product teams either.
Mm-hmm.
And so we spent a lot of time on, trying to build context for them, provide early forms of what eventually I think are called developer portals now, like dashboards and metrics that explain where they are relative to an objective. And it just didn't result in any actionable result, really. It's what we were finding is, if I would ask a team, what would it take for me to help you move forward, they would say, do it for me. Otherwise, we've got something else to do, right? And so a lot of feature pressure. So
sure.
So it was sort of dragged out. This idea of automating the way to the outcome we were trying to achieve was sort of a consequence of the specific freedom and responsibility culture.
Sure.
There at Netflix.
So freedom or responsibility. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? What is that concept at Netflix? So I think this is part of their cultural initiative.
It was one of their original culture deck. Really, they spoke quite a bit about this, and they were really hiring high performing individuals, whether that be engineers or marketers or whatever department. Usually fewer of them, more senior. Right. And then the idea was really, if you're going to hire the sort of the best of the best, just get out of their way, allow them to make decisions and execute on those decisions on the ground.
Right. Yeah.
And so as a cultural imperative, give them the freedom to act in the best interest of the business, but then also the responsibility to achieve a particular outcome. So
right.
So what we wouldn't have is very top-down processes like everybody must use a particular technology or a particular tool or a particular, because that would violate that freedom and responsibility culture.
Yeah. Sure. And but there were some limitations to that, as you were just saying, right?
There is.
There's some execution, maybe it's some issue with how they actually went about implementing that.
Right. So, I mean, the issue with freedom and responsibility, of course, is that you have some degree of decentralization. You have some people make different decisions, which can be somewhat inefficient. And that's just part of the cost of doing business in that way.
Sure. So Open Rewrite, was that kind of sprang out of that, your work at Netflix?
It did. And, so it wasn't so much I'm trying to tackle the problem of modernization, and I think I'm going to do it with automation and help the end, product engineer, so much as this was my only mechanism.
Yeah.
To get product engineers to move in the direction that we needed them to move in. Sure. And so when you sometimes culture does that. I think it can remove all the other options from the table and leave one. And I think in this case, that was the option that remained.
Yeah. So you talked about modernization, right? And I think Moderne, Moderna, that's the right way to say it, right? Moderna
it's
is
just
the right way to say
Moderne.
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 Okay.
So at the end,
All right. Yeah. So, and the modernization, the idea for code modernization is basically, I'm assuming that, back in the day we had, Fortran and COBOL and BASIC and Ada and all these languages. So there is legacy software that's out there. And there is probably billions, probably trillions of lines of code out there.
Absolutely.
Right? And modernizing it means that bringing it onto the platform and in the fashion and form and language where today's workforce can work with it. Is that right? Or
that's one component of it, and I would say an important component. And so, legacy modernization of say COBOL to a different stack altogether, a Java, C#, whatever the case might be, is certainly one portion of the problem.
Yeah.
But the problem that I think we focus on a little bit more and is maybe underappreciated is that once you're in a modern language stack, whether it be Java or JavaScript, C#, whatever the case might be, software production has been largely industrialized and componentized. And so when we develop a new customer experience, we're building with components that are provided off the shelf. Some of those are open source, some of those are third party. We're not starting from scratch. We're not building a stack all from vertically, from the ground up.
Sure.
And those components evolve at their own pace. So
Right.
you're left with, you're building on components, but you have to keep up. Otherwise, the whole machinery doesn't function anymore. So you can build faster because you're building in an industrialized way. You're building on it with componentization.
Sure. Right.
But there's a maintenance burden associated with that.
Right.
So in some ways, the more modern the application stack, the more significant this problem is, because you're building on quicksand effectively. The components out from under you are moving all the time.
Yeah.
Whereas an application that was written, 45 years ago on COBOL might still be very much running in the same way it always was.
That's true.
On that stack.
Right. So with the modernization goes this idea of refactoring.
That's right.
So code refactoring. Are they related somehow, or could you explain what that is?
Refactoring in this case, what I mean by that is really just any change you need to make to the code. And so that could be you're using some component, its API surface area changed somewhat, and you have to adapt with that. And so it could be, consolidating code or splitting code out or just changing API usages, or there's all sorts of different kinds of individual types of things that go into that. But
sure. Yeah.
It's always, you're adapting from a square to a circle, whatever that thing might be.
Yeah. Okay.
And when we think about componentization, it will often be the case that I'll develop hundreds or thousands of applications using the same component. That component changes. And so now I have a problem of having to go change all of these hundreds or thousands of applications in largely the same way.
Right.
But at many different points.
Sure. Absolutely. And what piece of this is, and I'm assuming there is a piece here where a code, back in my day when I was a software quality engineer, we used to talk about code usability or reusability. So if an engineer writes a code, it could be the same language. Let's pretend you write code in C. Someone else comes in and takes over that code, right? The responsibility for that code or the code base. He or she is also proficient in C, but at the same time, that person may not be able to follow what has been done before. So good standardization in terms of writing a code is not just that it does what it needs to do, but also it is written in a way that someone else can understand it.
That's right.
And build on it or work with it or change it, what it is that needs to do. Is that a component of that too? Or
there is. And part of that is about not making unnecessarily many distinct product choices to accomplish one thing. So, I could use a particular kind of database. I could use a particular kind of feature flagging system or monitoring system or whatever the case might be. It's understandable why we have more than one of many of those technology decisions in an organization. But at some point, we're always trying to kind of move towards a North Star architecture. We're trying to move towards some single decision. And part of that's like, how do I consolidate the tech stack to one approach so that when I move from one code base to another, I recognize what I see.
Okay. So then coming to your platform, so what does your platform do? And I know it uses AI in some way, shape, or form, but we used to have tools like that way back when, even without the AI. So we have an AI component. So if there was a way to encapsulate what your platform does and for whom,
the timeline might be revealing here. This open rewrite started nearly 10 years ago, so this is before the Gen AI wave. Yeah. And I think it was largely a rule-based system at that point. There's really two components to it. It's the data or the model upon which the system is operating, and then there's programs we call recipes, which operate on that data to transform it in some way.
Yeah.
So the data that we felt was necessary to accomplish these kinds of transformations accurately involved not just the text of the code or the syntax tree, like the structure of that text, but really everything a language compiler infers about that text as it's compiling it. So it's resolving which types came from which packages. It's trying to understand what the binary dependency relationships are between pieces of code.
Yeah.
And all of that information is captured into what we call a lossless semantic tree. So it's like the syntax tree plus everything the compiler knows, plus the original formatting of the code, plus some other metadata.
Right.
And then given that data, recipes are able to make informed decisions and mutate it in ways that lead to predictable outcomes.
Sure.
As the Gen AI wave has kind of come around, I think we've recognized that I still don't really want an AI system mutating the code directly because
Sure.
it would lead to, potential for hallucination. But AI can help me write net new recipes, which are programs faster, by looking at release notes and translating those into open rewrite recipes.
Right.
And in the inverse direction, we can supply this rich information about the code in form of a lossless semantic tree to a model to then ask it questions about that enterprise code base. So I may want to ask a question about a commercial bank division, what are all the feature flagging systems in use? And I need to understand not just the syntax, but I need to kind of reach through down to what the compiler knows to see what feature flagging libraries are used underneath the covers.
Okay, sure. One of the things that we like to get into a little bit is this. I think it's a very important question and very important thing to kind of get into, and also for our audience who is trying to understand, how to build a business and the fundamentals of building a business, is who is the person whose problem I'm solving, right? So for your business, for Moderne, who is your ideal prospect or ideal client?
There's really two, I think, at different levels of an organization. So one is the individual developer on the ground who's managing not just one source code repository, but hundreds, maybe thousands. And to give an example here, Shelter Insurance, which is a company I worked for, before Netflix, had about 40 source code repositories when I worked for them, about 70 people working for them, and engineers at least working for them.
Sure.
Fast forward, to today, and it's that same roughly 70 people working there, but over 2,000 repositories. So it's the amount of code under management has substantially changed over time.
Right.
And that's that industrialization we were talking about earlier. So right now, the cost of that industrialization falls on the individual engineer to try to keep all this stuff up to date.
Sure.
But I think from an economic value perspective, there's also the business unit leader, like a vice president or senior vice president or CIO or CTO or somebody that realizes that there's a technical debt pay down that they have to do in order to move faster going forward.
Sure.
And right now, their only avenue to do that is to basically hire external consultants or additional employees to just laboriously go through the code and manually lift it up one repository at a time.
Yeah. You mentioned this very important concept of, you said technology debt. Is that the term you said?
Yes.
Tech debt?
Yeah.
What is that? If you can explain that a little bit.
Yeah, tech debt is really, it almost has a negative connotation, I think, in the engineering industry, because in its original meaning, tech debt was really me as an engineer. I took a shortcut or, to get to an outcome more quickly. And I recognized that I accrued some debt that I was going to have to come back and pay down at a later date. But, I took that shortcut to get to this outcome more quickly right now. In today's world, I think there still is that, that does happen.
Sure.
But these ever evolving components upon which we build are viewed by the business as technical debt because engineering is saying, hey, I need to slow down here for a moment on feature delivery to go and repair all the underpinnings, the foundation upon which this application is built.
Sure.
Which means, we're always negotiating with the business, how much feature work am I going to do and how much maintenance work am I going to do.
Right.
It's tempting for the business to feel like that maintenance work is really engineering's problem. Like, you're the ones that did that. You should pay the cost of that. Don't ask me for time. Don't ask me for money on that. But realistically, the cost of modern software development is using components that change out from under you. So it's not really avoidable in that respect at this point.
Right. I'm visualizing this whole problem as like layers, right? You have this legacy software, things that have been done to bring that code to the functionality that's at.
That's right.
But there has been stacks that have been built that have been used prior to that. And then if you want to change a functionality here at the top level, and you and then you cannot do it there, then you have to trace that back and you have to go down into the layers and find out exactly where you need to make the change to, for example, add that feature or fix that bug. Is that
there's
is that
also
correct?
a level, and maybe a good analogy is really just like, a car. You buy a car, it's in perfectly new condition right now.
Right.
You drive it, you use it, and in so using it, you incur maintenance costs. Like, you're going to have to go change that air filter. You're going to have to change that oil filter. You're going to have to change the oil. You're going to have to, and if you don't, it's not going to function anymore at some point.
Right.
And that's really somewhat true of software as well. We asked it. We were working with a particular bank. They had about 250 engineers present for an on-site, and the question was asked of the whole group: if you could no longer touch the code of an application, how long does it continue to function? Or in other words, like, if you could no longer do an oil change, how long does that car keep going down the road?
That's true.
And the 80% said less than 6 months. If I can't touch the code of the application for 6 months, it'll stop functioning, because we've got all these components that are changing that aren't related to the functionality that it's delivering right now.
That is tremendous amount of work and tremendous amount of responsibility that is kind of on the engineer.
That's right. And that's just background all the time happening, right?
Right.
It's not net new features being delivered to the business. It's just changing the oil.
Right. So if you're not writing any new piece of code or adding any new, even
work
though
to
you
do.
don't do any of that, just to keep it running, you have to maintain the code. I didn't know that we had to do that with the software. So that is a tremendous amount of work that goes behind the scenes.
And that wasn't as true of the application that was built in COBOL 40 years ago on the mainframe. Because I think what was the case there is that you were using a largely vertically integrated component. Like, you were building the core components upon which you were building internally. So there was just very little third-party and open source stuff upon which you were building.
Absolutely.
And so it took a long time to deliver that new business functionality. But then, on the other hand, it wasn't as subject to changing out from under you like modern software is.
Sure. So what is your solution to this? What does your platform do that fixes this problem on a very high level?
Partly what we recognize is that when you're working in an industrialized way like this, that you're really selecting the same components over and over and over again to perform certain kinds of functionality.
Sure.
And so when that component changes, I don't need to just change it in one place. I need to change it in hundreds or thousands of places.
Right.
And so if I can make the change for that component, a program automated, then the cost of fixing it is constant, not linear with respect to the number of applications I have built on top of that component.
Right.
And so that really is like, create a program and then solve that same problem horizontally across the entire business, as opposed to doing it just one application at a time.
If you were to go back to, recognizing this problem and then getting people to see that there is a solution, so this is a complex,
it's very complex,
offering,
yes. Yeah.
complex problem. And then if you're looking to, a developer recognizes problem because he or she is living and breathing this on a day-by-day basis, and their team leaders and folks like that. But then you go into an economic buyer, and you're talking about tech debt. And they're like, what is that, right? So how do you, what is your sales process where you kind of get them to see that here's a problem that your company has, and here's what it's costing you, and we have a solution. So what does that look like? If you can kind of lay out your top level sales process to get folks to see the problem and your potential solution?
I think the problem is really well known
Is
by
it?
the
Okay, yeah, good.
economic buyer right now. I think you can go to any engineering executive and say, if you could wave a magic wand and just change one thing about your tech stack, what would it be? And you're going to hear the same refrain over and over again. It's going to be,
Okay. Yeah.
I'm trying to move from Oracle to Postgres, or I'm trying to move
Yeah.
from Sybase to MS SQL, or I'm trying to move from Java 8 to 17, or I'm trying to and some of them are trying to do that right now through some manual effort. Some feel like it's hopeless. Like it's such an effort. It's I'm not going to get it done in any reasonable amount of time.
Sure.
And they just feel like we'll just deal with an increasingly aging stack until it breaks. Really, you know. And so I think what's not as understood is that there is a solution here, because historically the only solution to this problem was really very manual work. And going back to an imperfect car analogy, it's like you drive that car until you need another CV joint or something like that. And rather than going to the auto parts store and buying a new CV joint and sticking it in, you fire up a forge in your backyard and you like get some raws, and you bang out a part, and then, build it. That's kind of what it's like right now. And so, I think the feeling is like, we just can't do that. So if we were able to reach that buyer and just identify what are the top 3 things you would change about your code base right now, if you could, there's usually no shortage of ideas. And the other thing is that I don't think most of those folks will recognize that there never will be an end to those ideas, because the moment that they solve these 3 things, there's another change and another change and another change, that this is never ending, that our tech stack is very fluid. It's not static.
Sure. So when your platform comes in, let's say someone says they recognize the problem, they see the solution, and they hire Moderne, and you come in and you do ABCXYZ to look at their code. So what is that process like? That onboarding, where is it something where they come in and they start using it, it's automated, or do you manually get involved somehow, somewhere to kind of look at what they're doing, and then there's some kind of a handshake happening between their team and your team, something like that?
I think the concept of being able to make a change, to go from A to B, whatever that might be, can almost be overwhelming. It's like sending a kid into a toy store. It's just like, what do I want to do first?
Exactly.
And so we've recognized over time that rather than giving an a la carte menu, which is pick any one of 3 things off of this list, let's give them a set course menu, which is, let's do one of these things, which is easy to review, is gets you used to the idea of multi-repository committing, and then let's move on to another type of use case, another type of use case, and from there, the world's your oyster. You can really go so many different directions with it, but let's start with
So you've broken it down into sort of extending the analogy of car and the machine. You take it to the dealership, or you take it to the mechanic, and they'll say, well, let me fix this one issue right now. Let me just change your filter for now, because that's oil filter or what have you. And that's one way to get started.
And it's going to be common for most cars. It's like, it's going to be the same kind of thing over and over again.
Exactly. And then over time, you begin to bring in other components and other aspects of the service.
That's right.
You go deeper and deeper, depending on what they need.
That's right. Yeah, and that can be very custom. So changing that oil filter may not be the most important thing right now. You may have a timing issue or something like that. That really is more important. It does improve the state of the vehicle. That's good. So let's do that. Let's get it done. And then we move on to whatever the more significant thing is.
Right. And I have to believe that some folks come to you when there is a disaster. So, that's like a triad situation where, my code base, something is broken. We can't figure this out. And our engineers have tried, and, we don't know. So are those times when you can come in and kind of try to help them out a little bit to pinpoint where the issue might be and then get them going?
It is. And I think when an issue is really crisis, then it's at that moment where you need to pair, and we didn't do this originally, but you need to pair a platform with the ability to make the change with a deep bench of professional services that can come in and do it right now.
Right.
In other words, you have the platform, you can develop the capability of migration engineering internally, but that can take some time, and you have to reallocate resources and train people.
Absolutely.
If there's a burning pain, we can do that with you now. And that's a very important part of a business like this, I think.
Absolutely. So going back a little bit, Jonathan, when you started Moderne, did you have sort of like a vision of what you thought the company would be like? So, you start the company, and then he's like, I'm going to start this company. And it'll be like this. I'll have this many number of employees. There'll be this kinds of engineers, after these kinds of clients, and these are the kinds of problems will be. So did you have a vision when you started the company, or you just kind of evolved? I think you said you got dragged into it. I think you used the term.
Yeah. I was dragged into the original problem at Netflix. I think from there I had gone on to Pivotal, which eventually got subsumed by VMware. And at Pivotal, I was working on a product called Spinnaker, which is a continuous delivery product. Adjacent to what we're doing, not really related. And that's where I met Moderne's co-founder, Olga Kunzic. We were working, especially in large enterprise, I think at JP Morgan, at Fidelity, at Home Depot, et cetera. Trying to layer in advanced continuous delivery. And the problem we kept hearing was, oh yeah, I'd love to do this, but talk to me in a year when I'm done trying to move my code from one state to another. So we kept hearing the same problem over and over and over again in those enterprise environments. And I think, it's at that point where we thought, wow, that problem is pretty universal. Everywhere we go. So it just felt like there was a compelling need for something like this to exist, rather than, we didn't start from, hey, we'd like to start a company, what should we do, and try to do. So maybe those customers that we were talking to when we were trying to do Spinnaker were the same ones we wanted to approach initially. So we did kind of approach it from we thought enterprise sale, like it's these places have a huge amount of code. And the problem is really extreme there. I also worry a bit about, critical sectors like banking running on aging infrastructure. So it's important to us personally, I think, to get that fixed. And to make some progress there. So we did start with an enterprise focus, and then that dictated, I think, the kinds of practices and people that we wanted to attract, which is later career, has seen a lot of scenarios inside of enterprise environments that respects the security requirements of these environments and knows how to build and sell for them.
So are you enterprise focused right now, or are you the more mid-size, your clientele?
We do both, and I think this problem is equally applicable to every vertical and size of company.
Absolutely.
If anything, we focus a bit more towards the standard and large enterprise than mid-market, just for the efficiency of that. And again, so, a product we build for that tier of customer can work down market from there. So it was definitely a start top of market and move down.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what you're saying is that your vision, you just started fixing a problem, and that evolved into a company.
That's right.
It's not like, you said, I'm going to have this kind of company, and then I need to kind of backtrack from there, which is very typical. It's fascinating. I talk to a lot of people, and in success literature and things like that, people talk about this, you must have a vision and things like that. But what I find more often than not is that people stumble into a problem, and they have a solution to that problem, and they somehow go and try to fix somebody's problem, and works out, and they get a traction somewhere. And then that kind of snowballs into a bigger and bigger and bigger company, at least for those who are not venture funded. Venture funded businesses are. So on
That's
that
true.
note, and so I'm assuming, are you venture funded?
Venture funded, yes.
You're venture funded, right? So that must be quite a dance, because, there are certain requirements that the venture community is going to put on you to grow at a certain rate. So what's your take on that? Are you a fast growth company or organically growing company or some thoughts on that?
I would categorize it as a fast-growing company. I think in the initial stages of venture fundraising, in that first year, there isn't an expectation that you're going to make tens of millions of dollars of revenue. So there's some degree, with the right investors, or some degree of patience at the beginning. I think it very much depends on the market you're operating in. So for us,
absolutely,
infrastructure companies, infrastructure software B2B companies tend to take a few years to really get going and kind of firing on all cylinders. And that was the case for us as well. And if you select the right investors, then that expectation is understood by all parties.
Absolutely.
I've always felt like, and from venture, we've taken more than we've given. I didn't have a huge Rolodex of enterprise, executives to reach in the beginning. The right venture partners do. Yeah. And so they get you in front of people when you really have no brand equity to work with.
Yeah. I think what you mean is that you've taken more value than you've given. Is that what you meant?
That's right. Yeah. I see it that way.
That's quite a testimonial for the venture capital with the VC community, right? I think they'll be pleased. So vision, right? Staying on the topic, what's your vision moving forward? Where do you see Moderne 5 years, 10 years down the road?
I see this data source about the code, which is really the intellectual property of a lot of businesses, as being a really important foundational building block. And with that data about the code, the first thing we tackled was really remediation of framework migrations and things of this sort, things we've been talking about.
Yeah. But
I think there's a larger application of that data. I think that there's applications to cloud cost optimization, to fuzz testing, to in large scale impact analyses, dead code elimination, that really are very difficult to do without that data. So I see, luckily, that we have a product that's very modular in nature, that we can just keep bolting on these modules. And so that gives me the sense that this business can be a standalone, independent company that continues to acquire technologies and bolt them onto that data, that grows internally as well, that can continue to add value to shareholders. And, not every product is that way.
In terms of number of people, revenues, profitability, when you get profitable, if you're not, I don't know whether you're profitable right now or not. Where are those factors a part of your vision?
In terms of number of people, I think we like working with really experienced, smart people. And so I think going back to that Netflix culture deck of freedom and responsibility, Netflix also had a very small number of engineers proportional to their to the product that they delivered. And I always thought that was really delightful, because it felt like everybody around you was really, top of game. You could rely on anybody. And that's the sort of organization we've strove to build, because it's enjoyable. It's enjoyable to work in that environment. So the skill level continues to up level the more mature we become as a company. And that's just exciting and fun, I think, to work in every day. And I think we'll continue along those lines, to sort of run the leanest organization in terms of total headcount. But with the most senior and most experienced people we can. And just make it fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, with the more experienced engineers, and I think now it's just my gut reaction to that I think you're in a good spot in the sense that there's a large pool of people who have tremendous amount of experience, and we live longer now, so we can our pool is there, and it's a deep experience that they bring to the table. And I'm assuming that it's not that difficult to find these people. I mean, it's never ever so easy, but relatively speaking, you can probably tap into the pool of experienced people who have been, around for a long time. And
that's true, and it gets easier over time, I think.
Yeah.
In the more mature the company has become, and the more stable the company has become, the less
Sure.
of that special characteristic of risk taking. You have to have an individual. So it's been noticeable, I think, after closing Series B, that it's a lot easier to recruit now than it was when we were a Series C company. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. A big part of what we do is the journey, right? So if you're building a business, it's the journey. And on that journey, there are people who come along. These are the people that, not just the developers and the engineers, but all of you, all the executive, all the way to all the people, basically, the humans. And they come along on this journey with you, right? So you're on this spaceship, and you're on the journey. So on that journey, what are some of the things that you've done, you think, that have made you successful in terms of what are some of the strategies that you implemented? What are some of the steps that you've taken? What are the systems that you put in place? There is something there that, unique to you, and you've been able to build this company to this level of success. If you could pick out like one or two things in the realm.
Yeah, one of the very first things we did.
Yeah.
The two first things we did when the business was first formed is, one, establish a brand design, which seems crazy, but I actually committed, to this brand design contract before we had the first money in the bank. So it paid out of pocket, initially. It's terrifying at the time. And to just establish, like, who are we first? And it takes some time. I remember our designer at the time saying, whatever we pick, it's not going to feel right for a while. It's you have
That's
to
right.
You have to live with it for a while. You kind of like grow into it.
Right.
And so I'm glad we did that very early and established that identity very soon. Along with that, and this seems like a very technical point, but we hired a PEO, which is basically outsourced HR, and that allows us to negotiate a risk pool with other small companies for better insurance and these sorts of things.
Yeah.
And that allowed us to offer better benefits plans and just like total compensation than we would have been able to do had we done it alone. Yeah. And then if you map that to the kinds of people we were really trying to recruit, which were later career, often are going to have families, or and this is a concern.
Yeah,
you lower the risk profile somewhat to hire a more senior person.
Yeah,
that was, I think, one of the best decisions we made in the first 30 days is to do that at that point, even though it felt really premature at the time.
Yeah. And when you talked about brand, was it the visual nature of the brand, the name of the company, or the slogan, or all of that, right? And also, it seems like you also set out some of the cultural aspects of it. Who is our best hire, kind of thing. It's not just who's our best client, which is important.
That's right.
But who is the person we're hiring? And I think that's kind of a stroke of genius, because that allows you to source this talent that's out there.
Right. And so you're thinking about who your buyer is, which in our case, large enterprise, which means, we need somebody has the maturity, has been in that space, that knows what they require. And, and so what do we need to do to make that possible? That was really important.
Sure.
On a cultural level, we were really inspired by a particular Harvard Business Review article from 20 years ago called "The Triumph of Humility and Fierce Resolve." And I think this combination of we try to be exercise a lot of humility on an individual level and as a company. When we approach a customer, we don't ask them to be somewhere they aren't. We try to meet them where they are. Always. Yeah. And then fierce resolve, we just won't give up. Like, we'll just find a way to make the product a reality wherever we're meeting that customer. And so I love that combination. Beyond that, we did not create a culture deck. Because to do so early on would have been able to, we would be setting something aspirationally that we may not live up to, and that would be ultimately seen as disingenuous. I think we watched for a couple years as people came and went, for the people that remain, for the people who have been here the longest, what are the facts, what are the characteristics of those people that make them successful here? And then let's try to explain from actuality what our culture is rather than do so aspirationally.
I love that. Yeah, you said we didn't build a culture deck. So, and I actually want to go back even beyond that. You said combination of fierce resolve and
humility. Yeah.
Right. I love that. And so there are certain cultural aspects that you have in place, but you're also wise enough to understand that you can't force every aspect of the culture.
No.
So you can't have a culture deck. Now, this culture deck idea, correct me if I'm wrong, does it come from Reed Hastings?
He did one. I think we've seen it in many organizations, though, that espouse a particular culture and what's important to them.
So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just gonna lay something out on you, and feel free to disagree. I think the cultural beat comes from the top, from the executive team, and at the same time, you can't force it. You can't force the culture. So there is like a buying process at one level, but also it has to be the right people on the bus with you in the first place. You have to have the right people, and then you can culture them, quote unquote. Any thoughts on that?
It does. I think at some levels it's driven from the top, but first of all, how much awareness do I have about myself and how I come across to other people, so that I could articulate what's important to me. Even,
absolutely.
Humility and fierce resolve felt was important, but beyond that, I don't know. And then the first 5 or 10 people that come in that form the core or foundation of the company are different than you as the leader of the company. And so collectively, what are the characteristics of this group of people, this initial population of people that were successful? Over time, it's possible that one of them leaves and someone else comes in. But more than likely, once you've formed that core, the person that fits into the team at a later date is going to more closely resemble what made the first people successful than anything else. So it's I think it's the leadership plus all the key initial employees, and together, what do you look like as a group?
Yeah, right. Yeah, those are great points. You use the word self-awareness, which I think is so important. Self-awareness in leadership, and as a person, as a leader, personal self-leadership, personal self-awareness among the leader, and how I come across, and being aware of that. That is a rare capacity, I think. But then maybe it's not. I don't know. But that's an important capacity to have, at least, right? Because I'm trying not to sound too critical of the leadership. So self-awareness on that point. Entrepreneurship or whatever the word is, and business building, this discipline and career of business building. The person who does this, it's not always moonlight and roses in that world, right? So people, you build a certain level of success, a certain kind of company, and people who are looking from the outside in, they're saying, "Wow, what a great company has built! It must be so good to be this person," right? And yet, when you look at it from, you look at the same thing from the inside out, as from the personal perspective, it's not always, wonderful things that are happening. There are some issues and some problems and challenges that we face. So if there was, sometimes, not all of us, but sometimes some of us go through what I call the dark night of the soul kind of a moment, where you hit some kind of an obstacle where you think, my God, this is unsurmountable. What am I going to do? That sort of thing. So have you ever had a moment like that in your journey as an entrepreneur? And if you did, how did you deal with it?
I'm sure this has been covered better by others. I think as the leadership team, you're mostly in dark moments. You're always dealing with whatever isn't working. So I think we had to be very intentional about celebrating the wins when they arrive. From an
Yeah.
external perspective, a win looks like something that arrives on the breeze, but from the inside, it's always it generally feels like, a Pyrrhic victory. Like I've worked so hard for this outcome, and I've compromised so much along the way. What remains, and yet you get enough of those wins, and there's, I don't know, something exists that didn't exist before. And I think I try to keep things in perspective and look at the business now and think, there's around 30 people working here now. There's a number of external consultants and freelancers that are employed in various customers doing things. This just didn't exist before. And so that's the thing that we try to focus on rather than the individual problems.
And, especially those of us who have some level of self-awareness, and you happen to be a person who actually used that term, and I think you have that. We all have it. I think that, the question is whether or not we bring it to
what extent,
our everyday, to what extent we actually live through that, right, and live with it and practice it, self-awareness. And I think you practice it. And so the question I have for you is Jonathan, who started Moderne, the same person as the Jonathan today, or Jonathan who was working at Netflix, the same person Jonathan today? What is the difference between Jonathan then and Jonathan today in this moment? If you can pick out just one or two things.
Probably not much different personality-wise, but bear more responsibility, I think, for individual decisions. And so, in some respects, I think, as an individual person, I think I've always been somebody that, to my detriment, will give and give and give. Like I will just, I try to please. And I think as a business leader, that's often not the right decision. Mm-hmm. And so it's good. I think it's a good tension to have, but I've almost had to fight against my nature to give too much, because I can give with authority and in a destructive way, I think, did, I think, early on at the beginning of the company. So, that's, but I've got folks around me too, and, another co-founder here that checks that instinct all the time. And that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. If there was someone who wants to start a company and comes to you for advice, and if there was one thing that you would tell this person, that this is, give up everything else, but don't give this one up. So, and I think another way of asking this question is, as everything changes around you, what do you think in your world, in your opinion, in your judgment, one thing that doesn't ever change and that you must hold on to? What would that one thing be?
I don't know how people build businesses that they don't feel feel it's being drawn out of them, because there's so many challenges along the way. So it's you really have to feel compelled, I think, to bring something into being, because the sort of inertia of the world is for this thing not to exist.
That's true. Right.
I heard this. I saw this phrase on a billboard here in Miami. I like to think this is representative of Miami culture, but it was a twist on an old phrase that said, "Give me the strength to change the things I cannot accept."
Yeah.
Right. And you've always heard the accept the things I cannot change, but change the things I cannot accept. Yeah. And I thought that's the sort of,
I love that. Yes.
I think, what you have to bring to it every day.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. That compelling instinct.
There has to be something you can't accept.
Right.
Because changing it's going to be hard regardless. Yeah. So.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for being on this podcast, having this conversation. I love the way that you went into the depth of who you are as a person. So those are always great conversations. And that's what we try to do on this podcast, get to the essence of who we are, right? as leaders, and also if I had your co-founder, for example, here, I would be having the same conversation, similar
right.
conversation with
right.
her. So if in terms of someone getting in touch with you, if what is something that's important right now for you to connect with other people about, and how do they get hold of you and get in touch with you?
They can certainly reach me on any of the social channels, LinkedIn, Twitter, always DMs open on both. You can reach us through Moderne.ai, and we try to be helpful wherever.
Sure. Yeah. And for our viewers and our listeners, mention the podcast when you reach out to Jonathan on LinkedIn, and he's more likely than not to accept your connection. So
that's right.
A little bit of a plug, right, for the podcast. So thank you again for being on the podcast, and hopefully we can circle back some other time and
absolutely
and have another conversation just like this.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. I like to do this one thing at the end. If there was one thing that you can improve in terms of the whole experience of being on this podcast as a guest, and obviously the most important thing to me is the conversation. So I like to kind of get a measure of what it was like to be on this podcast. What did it feel like?
I think you've got a good balance of personal and business.
Sure.
So that's good. Usually it's heavily one direction or the other.
Right.
I find it hard to talk about strictly who people are as a person without any understanding of what you're doing as a business and vice versa. So,
right.
That's a sort of rare mix that, mostly people focus on one or the other. And not both.
Right.
So you're saying, in terms of what I listen to, I will almost never listen to things that are strictly cultural or strictly like personality type. I don't know what people are building towards. Or if it's successful or whatever, that's relevant, I think, to whether you take advice from people or not.
Sure.
So keep that mix.